Okay, welcome everybody. It's a little bit past 3 o'clock on this nice Friday afternoon. The highlight of the week, as our guest just told us, to talk a little bit about research. Today we have a distinguished guest from the United Kingdom, Dr. Tereza Capelos, who's an associate professor in political psychology at University of Birmingham. She has been trained at the stronghold of political psychology in Stony Brook University, has made foundational contributions to our understandings of politics when focusing on things like emotions, and have been a big inspiration for us here in Amsterdam. And she's also the president-elect of the International Society of Political Psychology, which many of us would probably call our intellectual home. We are very honored, Tereza, that you found the time in your busy schedule to make time for us to share some of your work. Therefore, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to open the floor for you. Those of you who are new here today, if you want to ask a question to Tereza, if you're online, you can type it in the Q&A, and once the time comes, Gijs Schumacher will read the questions out loud and Tereza will answer. So that's it. Tereza, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Christian, thank you for this really generous, I think, opening and introduction. I'm very happy to be there. As I was telling you earlier, it's the highlight of my week, taking a little bit of break from all the other things that we do to think about the research that we love and that makes us tick. And it becomes even more exciting, I think, if this is done in front of an audience that understands the work, appreciates the work, but also expands the work. So I am looking forward to your questions, your suggestions for improvement, your criticisms, but with a little bit of caveat. The paper that I wanted to present to you today, a couple of months ago, was under review, but only a couple of days ago, we got the really good news that is accepted. So you'll be able to read the final version of this in print, and because now we just have a few more opportunities to just tweak it before we send it off, anything you say could be part of the paper. So looking forward to your input as well as an improvement. So let me share my screen. I think I can do that already. Here we are. And slideshow. There we go. Right. Okay. So for those of you that were at ECPR in Innsbruck a few months ago, this might look familiar. It is, I haven't changed the presentation. It is basically the same paper, the same work, which back then we revised a little further. The purpose of this paper, or the broader project that it sits in, is to put a question mark behind the big debates we've been having, many of you in the room and people who are joining us online and us as well, on emotionality in politics, and particularly anger. What does anger look like? What does anger feel like? How is it expressed outwardly? The kind of pro-social or anti-social outcomes that we see with anger, how can we understand it? And political realities, better or worse, have given us a lot of opportunities to experience, study, measure anger without even manipulating it in experimental contexts. And but it left some of us with a big question mark that what we have been writing about and labeling as anger is actually a mislabeling of anger. And that's what I'm here to talk to you today about. That's why the title of the paper is called Anger Issues, and the subtitle points to the grievance politics context in which we are understanding anger, but also ressentiment as an alternative complex emotional experience that I will try to show you, I think captures a little bit better, a little bit closer, the particular anger that me and many other colleagues have been looking at the past few years. So it starts with a mea culpa, because when I first published about emotions in politics a good like 20 years ago, I was labeling this anger too. Maybe because back then it was closer to the forms of anger we were used to in the early 2000s and the 2010s part of the story. But I will try to convince you perhaps, or get you to be puzzled a little bit about this other type of anger that many of us, perhaps because it's easier, because we are all used to be thinking of anger as anger, also because we are only used to operate in a very narrow framework of political emotionality, where we talk about aversive affect, anger, versus anxiety, anxious affect, i.e. fear. Many of us have been narrowing our vocabulary to two emotions, anger and fear, and we just try to fit everything we see in those two boxes. And I think inevitably we make mistakes that we should not be making, given our deep theoretical insights and our specialization. So this is for me acknowledging responsibility for wanting to be theoretically sound and empirically appropriate when we try to understand grievance politics. So this is a quote from one of the books that I will be using as part of our data set today. And it basically highlights the intense amount of anger and frustration and grievance that is part of this political reality that I'm interested in unpacking a little bit. It comes from Faluri's book called Stift, The Roots of Modern Male Rage. And that brings us nicely to the puzzle that I want to unpick today. This puzzle is this idea of the angry citizen. Many of us, and I talk among academics, so you can relate to that, we have been giving interviews to the media, to other colleagues. We have been thinking and writing about angry citizens who are vengeful, who are polarized, who either promote or become part of these uncompromising positions, antagonisms, anti-positions. And we all label them angry. We identify their emotional experience as anger, and we move on to talk about the implications of anger for electoral politics, for populism, for political leadership, for values, and all the dependent variables that we are interested in. So instead, I think, of the simple anger that we, again, in the context of political psychology, would like to acknowledge as anger, what we see is a more long-standing, a more bitter, a more disengaged and vengeful political stance that does not fit the conceptualization in psychology, the empirical approximations of anger, but instead is mislabeled, I think, in the way we identify it and we operationalize it. So the concept that I offer as alternative, and I wanted to put it up front-loaded for you so we can unpack it together, is this concept of ressentiment. It's not a pretentious way of talking about resentment. Resentment and ressentiment are different terms. They map to different psychological phenomena. Ressentiment is an emotional mechanism, or some of the colleagues call it a complex emotional experience, but it's not a clear emotion per se. It's a mechanism because it has a process. It takes grievances that we identify as deprivation, frustration, humiliation, lack of political efficacy. It comes from a very suppressed and inefficacious space, mental space, and changes them. That's why it's a mechanism, because it transmutes them to righteous indignation. That's what most of us would acknowledge as resentment, the pure and proper resentment, destructive anger, hatred, and rage. So there's a process here by which emotions go in one way, envy, shame, inefficacious anger, and pop out of ressentiment in a process of transvaluation and modification into righteous indignation, destructive anger, hatred, and rage. Now, what's interesting with this ressentimentful mechanism is that you don't need another agent or the additional input for this mechanism to kick in. Once the mechanism is at work, you put in envy, shame, and efficacious anger, and you get these antisocial outputs on the other side of it, which are not the same as an experience to what you would consider angry. So how can we disentangle ressentiment from anger proper, pure anger? That was the big question of the project, which involves this paper I will talk to you about today, but also a few others. So first, let's put anger and ressentiment against each other. As political psychologists, we know that we want to look at its properties. Yeah. So one of the interesting insights that we get when we look at angry politics research, the research that many of us do, is that there are deeper psychological dynamics of aggression that is kept down, is repressed. Yeah. But we also know that lots of the measurements that we are using as we're engaging with these, just look at the surface. Very often we just ask people if they're angry or afraid. Now, there is a problem with the self-reports because they are also socially constructed. There are those of us who study emotionology. We know that there are certain emotions that all of us admit to in particular context, societal context, personal context, and some other emotions that we wouldn't easily admit or easily be aware of. The mislabeling of emotions or the labeling of emotions, however you want to call it, is very often socially constructed and imposed. So people can be feeling things, they don't know what to call them, but easily can call them anger when somebody else tells them you fit the anger profile, you're angry, so they adopt a label. Sometimes is an easy also answer, how do you feel? Oh, I feel angry, than trying to dig a little deeper to the contents of your emotion, particularly if it's a painful one associated with envy, shame, and inefficacious anger. So there are intricacies there about how we need to be sensitive to the material around us and alert. And I think the best way to do it is to stay true to theoretical insights and empirical measurements that highlight what is anger proper and what is ressentiment as an emotional, complex emotional experience, and then put them against each other and see whether the things that we observe out in the real world map onto one or the other. This is the approach that I'm taking here today. Yeah. So the focus is grievance politics. We study ressentiment not 20 years ago, 50 years ago, but now in a particular very heightened context where within populist debates, we see bitter nostalgia, we see a lot of rumination, we know the anti-politics, the anti-stances, as we call them, and victimological perspective. This is a claims of self-victimhood, where you see even dominant groups in society saying, I'm the victim. And this is really, really interesting, again, within the content of the discussions of ressentiment, because victimhood is the axis of ressentiment, but that's for another talk. I'll come back, invite me back, and I'll tell you more about that project on victimhood. So going back, just to refresh our memory, or for those of you who want to investigate anger a little deeper, maybe that's a good starting point. So anger is a basic emotion. It's acute. It has a momentary effect. It's in the now. It comes from particular appraisals, cognitive psychologists tell us, about things that are not in our control, but are assessed, appraised as an abstraction or infringement to something that we want to get to satisfy a need, a goal that we want to reach. So if we feel obstructed, we get angry. It's a natural response to external social and or political stimuli. And it does things to us. Our body changes when we're angry. It's not just a mental state that leaves our body unaffected. When we are angry, there are changes in our mental readiness that prepare us to act. Then back in about, 10 years ago, I was writing about that, and many, many others. It increases our activity in the brain. Cognitive neuroscience studies show us that are linked to fight, so approaching the offensive stimulus, whatever that is. And it also increases our intensity to attack without engaging our very systematic cognitive processing. So without deliberation very much. So we're prone to act, not much to think or to talk, unlike fear. And there's a lot of studies that contrast anger and fear. So you're probably familiar with the differences between them. So what other things does anger do? When we look at it in relation to political objects, it's usually associated with negative reactive orientation, so negative anti-stances, but also optimistic risk estimates that's linked to your desire for movement to go and do things. So you think your risk is not as high. Outgroup aggression, so antisocial expressions of anger, discontent, and desire to punish. And there's fantastic scholars who have been doing work here that I can send you references. The reference list is long on this one. And it's also considered not a bad thing to have. It is a healthy and appropriate response to realities, because if something is unjust, if something is unfair, you want to get angry, you want to get it out there. Passivity in unfair context is not a very pro-social outcome. So we don't want to keep anger down. That's not the point of this work. We want to understand it, appreciate it, and see it for what it is. What is ressentiment? It's not anger. So ressentiment is not a temporary reaction. It's a chronic compensatory emotional mechanism. I told you about the mechanism before because it has a changing process. Things go in, different things go out. And you don't see this usually with emotions. Emotions are what you see at the beginning and at the output. It's in certain places where you would find ressentiment. You look among disprivileged individuals, those that perceive the situation as being compromising them. It doesn't have to be compromising them in reality, but it's the self-perception that matters, right? So it's the fantasy, the imagination, the perception that matters here. If you want to think about this in the context of a popular story, think of Ressentiment as the fable of the fox and the sour grapes. You might remember that from Aesop, and as Greek, that resonates really well to me from my early age. There is a fox. How many of you in the room know about this? Hands? Okay, let's go through it. So there's a fox. It walks in a meadow. It sees those grapes. They're hanging off the vine. The fox tries to grab, jumps to reach the grapes, fails. Jumps again, fails. Jumps again, fails. And every failure comes with more pain, more disappointment, more frustration. And the fox keeps jumping and keeps failing. So the fox keeps coming with excuses about why. It's the floor that is slippery. My legs are too short. The grapes are too high. Eventually, the fox stops jumping anymore. Is too frustrated to jump and devalues the grapes. Says those grapes are not sweet. I don't want them anymore, and I'm better off walking away. I'm not a loser anymore who was trying to get those grapes. I am better off without them. I don't need them. And so devalues the grapes, reevaluates the self from a loser image to somebody who is a morally righteous victim and walks away. Right? So this is the context in which you see ressentiment. It is a situation where somebody keeps trying, doesn't have access to resources that they need or to the rewards that they want. They feel constantly devalued, compromised, and these repeated frustrations trigger ressentiment. And the outcome of ressentiment is that walking away, that devaluation. The process of devaluation is a clear characteristic of ressentiment. And we call it transvaluation, the change of values. Right? There's a lot of work on ressentiment that comes from political theory, political sociology, philosophy of the mind. And my co-author here, Mikko Salmela, is one of those mind philosophers who has been working for a really long time on ressentiment, and I learned a lot from Mikko. What he taught me is that ressentiment is driven by particular emotions. The things that feed it is shame, envy, and inefficacious anger. Yeah, you can imagine the fox trying to jump for the grapes and failing, and it comes with this powerlessness and that sense of inferiority. I'm not good enough. Somebody else has been getting my grapes, or somebody else can get my grapes. What happens with ressentiment as a process, if you look at it deeper, for those of you comfortable or willing to be comfortable with psychoanalysis, not everybody wants to or should be, it involves idiosyncratic defenses. They have to do with how strong your ego, your sense of self is, or as we say, your self-concept, to withstand fighting. But defenses, in a way, are natural mechanisms that give us a little bit more mental health. But these defenses, and we'll talk about defenses in a little bit, allow us to maintain a sense, a kind of like a healthier sense of self than completely giving up, through the transvaluation of who we are, from inefficacious victims to morally righteous victims, and our values, from the things that we valued highly. In the fox is a very easy value. I want the grapes. I value the grapes positively, to reevaluating and now valuing the grapes negatively, right? And valuing the self from negative to positive. So you see how the values change. The values we assign to things, right? What happens after ressentiment, or after the ressentiment process is at work? You see at the other end, resentment, indignation, hatred, which is reinforced through social sharing. That's the last stage of ressentiment, where individuals don't just hang out with themselves, but they hang out with other foxes that have the same experiences, and they all ditch the grapes together. So that revalidates the dispositions, the values of ressentiment. It is different from resentment, and that's important, because resentment is a clear emotion that is a moral anger at unfairness. It doesn't have a mechanism attached. There's nothing in resentment that goes in, comes out different. Yeah. And resentment has the ability to act, whereas ressentiment is inefficacious, is frustrated. If you have resentment at the end, that means you've gone through a process of ressentiment. This is to clarify also, resentment doesn't always, resentment doesn't always come through resentment. You can have independent resentment, but we also measure it as an outcome of resentment very often. And then there's an affective driver function that it has. We find it in our work on reactionism, this desire to turn back towards sometimes an invented world, the reactionary anti-stances. That comes with another interesting, very interesting social phenomenon, collective narcissism. And there are some colleagues at Kent, Alex Chikoka and a few others, that are looking at this as they're looking at collective narcissism in relation to anger. So we're talking about how it can link to resentment better in the context of populist politics. So let us move forward a little. So I know I gave you a lot of information, so this slide probably consolidates. Anger comes from a process of obstruction to a goal. It is a response to a perceived injustice. It motivates us to act. Resentment is chronic, compensatory. It involves this transvaluation. It has psychic defenses. It contains anger, envy, shame, inefficacious anger, envy, and shame. And it spits out resentment, indignation, and hatred. So this in a table format, where you can see a little bit the differences between the two concepts. Anger is focused on injustice. If we go on this side of the screen here, sense of efficacy, because that always is expected with anger. Action, and it's temporary. Resentment, the core of it is victimhood, inefficacy, passivity, inaction, because that inefficacy holds us back from feeling we have agency to change the situation, whereas with anger, we go forward to change it, and it's long lasting. It's not temporary. It's a chronic condition. It's, in a way, important for us to keep that into account, because if it is a chronic condition, its implications for political outcomes is much more long-term and more significant than temporary anger responses to political stimuli, be it policies, issues, party positions, and so on. So told you a little bit about the measurement. Let's go a little further. So how do we do this kind of work? It's not easy. So I'm as you might know about me, I was a trained experimentalist at Stony Brook. I do a lot of experiment surveys. I worked at the Stony Brook Political Psychology Survey Center that we had there as part of my postdoc, so highly trained in quantitative methods. And then now we have to go and investigate things that are a little bit deeper. So we thought, if we even do interviews, which I have been, or focus groups, it's difficult to get to this. Why don't we try to look at material that we have out there that already claim anger? Try to code for what is angry and what is resentimentful, and see if we can tease them apart. So that's what we did. we thought, okay, we're very fortunate to all of us have had access to really good books in the past 10 years that are dealing with anger. They identify their participants as angry. They also contain interviews. That was really important for us. So we wanted to find books by academics that contain interviews with individuals, participants identified as angry, individuals that self-identified as angry and were written by the academics as describing their anger. So the whole books, the books that we used were about anger. They had nothing to do with ressentiment. They didn't think of ressentiment. They didn't measure ressentiment. They didn't ask questions about ressentiment. So no bias there in trying to find the thing you're looking for. We had an environment in which we were going against the efforts of the original authors to find anger. So we were just, I think it's a hard test in that sense. So Angry White Men is one book. Strangers in Their Own Land, Arlie Hochschild's book, is the second one, and Stift is the third. So what did we do there? We read the books closely. When reading the books, we were taken aback by how much what we identified as ressentiment we thought we could read in those interviews, but then we thought, okay, our own insights don't matter here. Let's see if we can codify this. So we looked at all the interview excerpts that were in those original books. And these are experts with middle class party activists, Trump supporters, a range of people that identify in those books as angry. And they are all in the US. So there's a little bit of a consistency in the sample. So what I'm telling you applies to the US right now. We have done different work that looks at the UK and other European countries, but that's not as part of this analysis. And all of them talk about the frustrations and their dissatisfactions, and what they claim is their emotional state is anger, both by themselves and by the authors of the books. We found 164 excerpts that had elements of anger in them. So we're not searching for ressentiment right now, we're looking for anger, right? 71 in the first book, 26 in the second, 67 in the third one. And these excerpts, we refer to them as statements, and they're our unit of analysis. So these are interviews that were conducted not by us, by the authors of the books, and they were assuming they were talking to angry people. The key variables that we coded for were aimed to differentiate, to identify anger, where it stands, and also identify ressentiment as clearly as we could, and then set them apart. So we know that anger is anger, rage and rage, screws, so implicit and explicit emotions that talk about anger were codes for anger. We know ressentiment from our other work has particular components, so victimhood, transvaluation, envy, powerlessness, injustice, and a sense of destiny. And we have done other work where we actually created a scale. You might be interested in that as well, to use in your work. It's like a 6-point scale for surveys that measures all these elements or components of ressentiment. So you could see in a survey how it sits against anger proper. We also had a challenging, but I think really stimulating and worthwhile task, struggle to identify defenses like projection, introjection. Projection is, I'm not bad, you are. Introjection is, you're so good, and because I'm associated with you, I'm good as well. So I take in bits from outside. Splitting is the world is black and white. Denial, facts you are familiar with. Reaction formation is I don't want this, I hate it. So it's that kind of thing. Reacting, that's not good, it's bad. I'm not bad, I'm good. That's reaction formation, just taking the opposite. We also needed measures of efficacy, because we know efficacy and anger, they go together. Efficacy, low efficacy and ressentiment go together. We wanted activity, because we know that ressentiment is inactive and anger is active. We also coded for different types of anger. We looked at anti-stances, because in our theoretical framework, ressentiment fits well with anti-stances, because it's the emotional mechanism of reactionism. And the more you see anti-stances, the more that screams reactionary orientations, be careful or be alert. And so we were looking for anti-stances. I'm against feminism, I'm against government, against immigration. That's how we were coding these. And also nostalgia in the context of populist politics. Ressentiment goes well with that. So what did we find? Now, this is a qualitative content analysis. We had intercoder reliability that we tried with 3 coders. So at the end, we were convinced that we were not, subjectively coding things. There is some subjectivity in any coding, but at least we had some sense of reliability. And then we started seeing a lot of evidence of ressentiment in places where you would expect to see evidence of anger. So of the 164 statements that we were coding, incidents of anger proper were 84 counts, and we had 313 counts of ressentiment. Now you'll say, well, you use 4 instruments for anger and 6 for ressentiment. Of course, you would expect to find more. That's not the comparison we're interested in. It's not more or less. That doesn't matter really. What matters is that there shouldn't be any evidence of ressentiment in places where anger is at work. You shouldn't see victimhood, right? You shouldn't see powerlessness. The only thing that anger and ressentiment overlap on is injustice, that sense of injustice. And I'll show you the counts of that. They don't make up for 313. So what we were interested in here is, why do we have these instances where traces of ressentiment come up in excerpts that are about anger, or the authors and the people who feel that label it as anger? So immediately we started thinking, maybe the labels don't matter very much. Let's look at the affective content, the emotional, the content of these affective experiences and see what they actually are. So then we started comparing different kinds of statements. We looked at statements that had anger and no ressentiment. These are 10 statements of the whole, versus the statements that were high on ressentiment, that had 4 and above elements of ressentiment in them. And we thought and then we had other combinations as well. But for now, I'll talk to you about these because we thought these are the polar opposites. These are the purely angry statements with no ressentiment in them, versus the highly ressentimental statements that don't contain any, that are easily set apart. So for comparison's sake, I'll show you some bits in a little bit. Breaking down, what kind of things did we find that we didn't expect? We didn't expect to find victimhood, and it was there in 116 statements. We didn't expect to find envy or powerlessness or sense of destiny or transvaluation. Injustice was always supposed to be there, but it was only there 12 times. Some of them fit in the anger coding as well. So defenses. Defenses was a challenge for us because it's not easy. It's not easy for quantitative political psychologists to start thinking of psychoanalytic terms of Kleinian and Freudian psychoanalysis, but it's worth exploring because that's what the mechanism employs. I think we have to, as I said before, stay true to the concepts and perhaps reach a little bit further beyond our comfort zone and read. So I've been reading a lot on psychoanalysis the past 3 years to get my head around this, and proudly wrote an article a year ago on the defenses of ressentiment, which is purely theoretical, but really enjoyable for me. And I had a real diversion or departure from the quantitative world I have been inhabiting. So defenses, in 45 statements, 55 counts, so some statements were double loaded, a lot of projection, 35%, a lot of splitting, a lot of denial, some introjection and reaction formation. And they were higher in statements that also contained victimhood and envy. Makes sense. You see defenses more in places where you would also expect to have ressentiment. So let me show you a little bit some comparisons here. We are going to compare the high ressentiment statements with the no ressentiment statements. And what do we see here? We see inefficacy. Inefficacy was 75% mentioned in the high ressentiment statement. So people saying, I don't have agency, I cannot, I don't have power, I'm worthless, I don't mean anything, right? So 75% in those statements versus 36 in the no ressentiment statements that mentioned efficacy, the flip side. There were no mentions of inefficacy in places where we identified anger. So theoretically, anger displays as we would expect. So the theory of anger that says that it comes with efficacy was reported. We didn't find statements of ressentiment with efficacy, and we didn't find statements of anger with inefficacy. And we also saw that when there was inefficacy, there was destiny, victimhood, powerlessness, and envy. These are traces, reflections of ressentiment. We also found inaction. There was a lot of inaction in the statements altogether because I guess the interviewers were not probing to ask more about action. But in the high ressentiment statements, we had 75% inaction versus 61 in the angry ones. And again, more in destiny, transvaluation, and powerlessness statements. And we found action in anger when it related to injustice. So that again shows us that the way we theorize and understand anger is correct. The problem is that we mislabel it when we see it out there in the real world. And anti-preferences, again, we found 69% of the high ressentiment statements contained anti-preferences versus 46 of the anger. So would we have been writing about in the context of populist politics and anti-stances and anti-politics that these are angry, there is ressentimentful? Context is even more anti than the angry one. So we are basically thinking at that point, as we're looking at this data, that these anger-focused interpretations of what is expressed in response to dissatisfaction and grievance conceals ressentiment. We label it anger, we talk about it as if it is anger, but when we dissect, open up its psychological components, it's not anger. It's closer to ressentiment. So this is the key contribution. I don't know, I had a slide with a table in the defenses. What happened? Did I jump it? Here. I showed you this, right? So I skipped this. Okay, these are the defenses. So this is what I was describing before, but now if you look a little bit here, you see a lot of defenses, most of them in splitting. This is a tally of these. So most of them in splitting and in projection. So statements that contained splitting, the world is all bad, my party leader is all good. Yeah, that's splitting. You don't see ambivalent positions within the things you talk about. Projection, they are bad, we're good. Yeah, we are good, they're all bad. So projecting all your bits, your bad bits out. Denial, and denial is really important in the context of fake news and alternate realities that we live in. Introjection, not as much, but still then reaction formation as well. And here you see the different kind of defenses, how different elements of ressentiment play out in defenses. And what you see here is the prevalent role of victimhood, envy, and powerlessness that are here, that are key elements of ressentiment. So a lot of defenses, when we found in text traces of victimhood, envy, and powerlessness, point to defenses being employed in the context of ressentiment. So here we are. This is the contribution of the paper. We are thinking that we need to be thinking a little bit more about what anger is and what anger does to us. What we see in those books that we analyze is this repressed aggression, which is not angry, it's ressentimentful. It's not short-lived, it's long-term. And we want to think a little bit more about this in the context of grievance politics. We want to think a little bit about how it links to perceptions of victimhood, low efficacy, and backward values that constitute this framework of reactionism that we have identified in our populist contemporary politics. And another thing that we thought was good about this paper is that we were able to make use of secondary data interview excerpts. There is a lot of material out there that many colleagues collect They code it for their own purpose, for their own research, and then they put it aside. Nobody uses it. Nobody has any value for it. What we were able to do here is look at these interview excerpts that were available to us and code them systematically code them for evidence of what they were collected for, but also the concept that we were coding against. We used this novel measure of ressentiment that I briefly told you about with the 6 components. Ask me about it. And we took a little bit of a dive, I think, to look a little deeper in defense mechanisms and how transvaluation, not transvaluation, has been delivered, the change of values. So the so what point. I think, and those of you that know me know how much this matters to me, I think we need to look at the psychology of the political phenomena that we are studying. Political behavior scholars look at the outcomes. Political psychologists look at the process of political decisions. If we are not true to our theoretical training and we don't see concepts out there as what they're expected to be, I think we are doing a disjustice to our academy and also to the world around us, because we mislabel things. So I'm really very conscious of that. Trying to think how we understand anger in the context of populist politics matters. And thinking about the political implications also matters, because anger and ressentiment have different outcomes, different societal outcomes. So this fits in a broader, again, debate. When I gave my presidential address at ISPP in Athens, some of you might have been there, on democracy as an achievement, I was really interested in understanding how we can realize our understanding of the world by carefully recognizing conflict within us and external conflict. I think conflict and the emotions that drive it, like anger, are really, really important in helping us come to terms with that conflict and having ways to find pro-social ways to address it. If we think we're angry, but instead we are resentmentful, we cannot realize our false sense of victimhood. We cannot realize our vindictiveness, our hatred, our antisocial stances against others. We see them as our entitlement. And I think the closer we come to labeling the things we feel as appropriately and true to their psychological contents, the closer we'll be to understanding them and managing them. So that's the end of the talk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tereza, and I'm really happy to see this presentation now, because I unfortunately had to miss your presidential address in Athens, and actually I think very few of us were there for a variety of reasons. Remember, you, Christian, were unable to fly to Athens because of flight cancellations. So it's great to hear this really interesting story. We now have some time for questions, also for the people online. The people online can type their questions into the Q&A. And while they do so, I look around the room and I see an immediate question about that. Oh. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. My question taps into emotion regulation. I would say that based on what you said, I feel that the difference between resentment and ressentiment is mostly that there is shame that is transformed to anger either successfully, and it is like resentment, or unsuccessfully because of repression or emotional suppression, whereas in the other case, maybe there is some acceptance or cognitive reappraisal or something. So do you think that this might be the case, that it's rather than an emotion, it's an emotion regulation strategy or failed emotion regulation process? And related to this, do you think that this difference between, so do you think that it's that reactionary politics is characterized by ressentiment because of different emotion regulation strategies applied, or by conservatives or reactionaries and progressives, or it's more a different worldview that, for example, conservatives blame refugees for their problems, and in reality, whatever it means, they are not the ones who should be blamed for economic inequalities, or yeah, this is my question.
It's a really good question. How do you want me to do this? Do you want me to collect questions, or shall we do them one by one?
Depends entirely on you. Maybe collect questions. Yeah.
I'm happy to answer this now.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, shall we? Okay,
Yep.
let's try, and maybe that will give time to everybody else to kind of get their thoughts together. I think it's a really good question. I don't have a problem going with you where you want to go on the emotional regulation process. There are different things that we call this phenomena that we observe. An emotional regulation process could be a label for it, to the extent that it's a conscious one, right? So there's the big question there with emotional regulation. All the work assumes that you're aware of it, and you know, and you're working on how you regulate your emotions. Ressentiment as a mechanism is a mechanism that kicks in, that has a purpose for you to manage your sense of self, but that's not conscious. The individuals who are in ressentiment are not thinking they're employing an emotional regulation mechanism. It happens to them. It has benefits to them in a sense that it allows them to not kill themselves, but go about their business in a more revised moral framework that allows them to see themselves as valuable and what they don't have as worthless. So it allows them to continue in a way. It's not pro-social because its outcomes are not benefiting the social good. They're more outcomes that punish targets that very often are not worth punishing. And what you mentioned about immigration within the context of populist politics, where there's scapegoating, when there's a lot of blame shifting, projection processes where you are not all the bad elements, all the bad emotions you might have about yourself, you project them outwards. You find almost like a place to place them, is understandable. I think it makes sense the way you describe it. I wouldn't use the word successfully processing and unsuccessfully, because all of these mechanisms or regulation processes have success, and at the same time they have failure. We know from emotional regulation research, for instance, that it's very cognitively costly. We also know there is emotional labor. So emotional regulation, scholars look at the emotional labor that is employed by the individual to manage emotions, by not showing them or by changing them, even by shifting the content. So all of these mechanisms, processes have costs and benefits. The question is to what extent the individual can live a happy life in the long term that does not impose a negative life on somebody else. How happy are they, right? And I think that's where psychology meets politics if you flip it on its head. So yes, I would agree with you. I use different labels. I work more with processes that are not conscious rather than emotional regulation that can be trained, the strategies of the mind and how you approach your emotionality. But both the place where we meet is the awareness. Both of these, to get out of them, to face reality, require some awareness, some tuning with your inner self. So I think that's where I meet you. And yes, I agree.
Thanks, Tereza. Other questions? There's one question online, or it's a suggestion from Rosa Sanchez Salgado. She congratulates you with the publication, and she has a remark. She says, I would not talk about repression of aggression. I would rather talk about repression of anger. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but
maybe Rosa can tell us why. Because in the literature, you would see repression of aggression. You could also see repression of anger. In this case, yes, in our data, if Rosa is talking about But even in this case, because our coding was not just explicit mentions of anger, but also implicit, we have hatred, we have rage as proxies of anger. So it is part of aggression in a sense as well. But yeah, but maybe Rosa, would it be possible to clarify why you would not talk about repression of aggression? Maybe we can leave that and come back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had another question. Is you say that you do not expect powerlessness to go with anger, and I was wondering why. If I think about the appraisal work, one of the conditions for anger to occur is a situation where there is human control instead of situational control. And so it felt a little bit like you were talking to this specific line of argumentation. I'm not sure if that's the case, but maybe my thoughts are that you become angry not because you have control, but because some human is controlling it. It could be changed, but I'm not the person who's able to do it. So I feel powerless, right? Or what am I missing here?
Yeah. It's a good starting point. It's a really good starting point, but I wouldn't go with you all the way. So if I feel that somebody else has control and I don't, that can be the beginning of a lot of things. It can make me angry. It can also make me feel powerless. If you cannot be powerless and angry at the same time, you can have an emotional reaction that you don't know what it is and you call it anger, but anger doesn't go with powerlessness because anger goes with efficacy. You get angry when you feel somebody else has control, and then you get angry and you go and you do something about it. So at the moment that you have become angry, that powerlessness or the position of being powerless is replaced by your anger. So anger comes and fills that void. It happens like that from the appraisal. So, but once you're in a state of anger, you don't think you're powerless anymore because you're angry and you have efficacy. So yes, it can be stimulated by an appraisal that somebody else has power, but once anger kicks in, it takes you. This is the beauty of anger in any emotion. It's empty, right? Takes you out of the space and gets you to break stuff or go show them what you've got, right?
Yeah.
If you remain powerless, which is what happens with a fox, you don't get angry, right? You don't get like a branch and start destroying the grapes. That would be anger. You walk away, you devalue them. In a way, Ressentiment protects you from damage at this point. You don't break stuff, but you breed that bitterness and that vengeance that you have to release somewhere else, and you release it in an antisocial way afterwards.
Yeah.
So I would say anger is better than Ressentiment. It can have more pro-social outcomes. People get together when they are angry, and they do things.
Yeah. Thanks. There's a question here from Matthijs.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting story. I like the Ressentiment analysis a lot. Before I ask my question, I have one question for clarification. Can I summarize your approach as saying that when we see and analyzing contemporary politics, when we talk about anger, in many instances, we should actually talk about Ressentiment?
I think we should start thinking about that. I don't want to say, I think you're in a, yes, absolutely. half of me wants to say yes, but the other half of me says be careful. Because here's what I want to say. What I want to say is that let me use a metaphor that I like. If we are always used to be eating with a fork, and somebody brings us a soup, or we find ourselves in a soup restaurant, we are not going to be very good with our fork. We need to start thinking about what tools can we have, both empirical, right, and also conceptual, to understand the phenomena around us, our the reality that we are invited to examine. So in a sense, I want us to be inquisitive. What my desire would be is that we ask the question, is it anger? Is it ressentiment? Is it resentment? What is it? And some of us are not really good at that. We see the world, we split. We see the world in black and white. It's either angry or afraid. We also do this other crazy thing, which is insane. We talk about negative emotions as if anger and fear are negative, right? And we fail to see the positive side of these emotions. Every emotion has a positive side and a negative side. So it's really important to take a step back before we use certain terms and think about what we're doing as academics. If we have anger in front of us, and in our data, there were instances where there was just pure anger. It is important not to call that resentment or ressentiment. It's important because if it doesn't have moral indignation, it's not resentment. So what I guess I want to say, if I can say it with fewer words, is that we have to use conceptual instruments and empirical instruments to interrogate the reality in front of us, rather than just label it and move on, right? Especially when it has psychological implications. For us, for political psychology, what we label an emotion matters, right? If we keep going around saying citizens are only angry or citizens are only afraid, when we narrow down Brexit to anger, bless you, anger and fear. I mean, it's insane if you think about it, how oversimplified we have made our own political psychology, right? So that's I guess the starting point.
Yeah, I've one question about that, because I think question to what extent we always use the term anger to describe this politics of populism or discontent, because we use all kinds of concepts that include psychological concepts, but also sociological, political science, like political discontent or social status loss or relative deprivation connected to emotions also of disgust, of contempt, etc. So to what extent is it true that we are all ascribing this to anger? So my question basically is, why do you position, to some extent, in how you structure your story, anger against ressentiment? Why that distinction, and why do you put them against each other? Because I think they're really different things, and I really follow your argument in favor of ressentiment, but not so much that other part of that story.
Yes, I hear you. So you were telling me, are we fighting a straw man?
A little bit.
Yes, and I take your point, and it's a really good point, because from where you stand and where I stand, I completely appreciate what you're saying. European political psychology is much better because it has particular influences. But if you look at the other side of the Atlantic, when we present this kind of work, there are scholars that are teaching, they're colleagues of ours that are advanced, and they say to you, no, there's only two ways to think. There's four emotions: anger, fear, hope, and pride. That's it. That's it. And if you tell a different story, that story doesn't fit the paradigm, and that story then becomes not very comfortable. So whereas in European political psychology, and I'll tell you how I know this, I figured this out in 14, when with Katarina Kinville and Henk Dekker and Paul Nesbitt Larkin, we wrote the Palgrave Handbook of Political Psychology, the global handbook, right? And we were dealing mainly with European colleagues who were sending us their work. And we found this abundance of theoretical insight and depth understanding for emotionality, like the one you mentioned, that comes from insights from political sociology and psychology and broader account. But in the American work, if you look at what is being published and what is being out there, is very much on anger, fear, and the model kind of continues like this. And lots of young academics are trained on this bipolar structure of emotionality. So I am with you 100%. If the strawman is smaller than I think, even better, right? Even better.
Thanks. Okay, we unfortunately have run out of time.
Already?
Yes, sir. So there are a few more questions, but we need to wrap up. Thanks a lot, Tereza. This was super interesting, particularly completely with you regarding the first of the last things you said about the distinction between the European and American approach, you call it this way. I think there's a lot of room for innovation and updating there. I'm hoping that we'll see each other in Montreal so that we can give you the Hot Politics Lab coffee mug.
Yes.
Or tea, if you prefer that, or something stronger maybe. I want to thank you very much for joining us here today. I want to thank the people online as well, and the people who are here. We're going on a short hiatus. There's a holiday next week that the parents in this room take seriously. And the week after there's a lab retreat. And so November 4, we're back with Flavio Acevedo, who will give a talk on how to measure ideology. And then the rest of the schedule, I refer you to our website. Thank you very much, Tereza, again. So the sponsors, we make a habit of forgetting the sponsors. Who are the European Research Council? Thank you very much. It's been 4.5 years of great work. NWO, University of Amsterdam,
Politics and the life sciences.
Politics in the Life Sciences.
And whoever wants to contribute more.
Yeah, exactly. More money is always welcome. Okay. Have a good weekend.